today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Jason.
Thanks very much, Carol. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on wherever you are in the world today. I know it's people are talking about the new normal, the sort of kind of crazy world that we live in. Who would have thought that 2020 was going to turn out to be such an interesting year? I actually found a bit of a meme joke, if you want to call it, that basically said that 2020 divided by 5 is 404, kind of like year not found. So I suppose it kind of reflects the way that the year started. So firstly, thank you everybody for joining me on tonight's webcast, the SANS at Mike Talks. It's one of the initiatives that SANS has taken during this kind of crazy time that we all find ourselves in globally, to give back even more to the cybersecurity and InfoSec community around the world. Making sure that even though a lot of us are affected by what's going on out there, we can still get our own training in, we can still bind together as a community, share what we know, and basically just try to still make the world a safer place. So firstly, a little bit about myself. I've been working in digital forensics for quite some time now, 22 years. 17 of those years I was basically working in law enforcement. I was working for the South African Police Service as a detective, and I was then ultimately transferred to our National Anti-Corruption Agency, and I headed up the cyber forensics laboratory there for a number of years. Obviously, as a result of the work that I've done, when I was in law enforcement, I spent a lot of time in court, and even now, having moved into the private sector, whether it's doing, sort of employee misconduct, insider investigations, or even incident response matters, I still spend quite a bit of time in court, not only just in criminal trials now, but also in civil trials. I'm a fairly active digital forensics researcher. I always have 1 or 2 digital forensics projects that I'm working on, to get publications out, to share with the community. I'm currently teaching 4.500, which is the Windows forensics class for SANS, as well as 4.508, which is our advanced incident response, threat hunting, and cyber intelligence course. And I'm also one of the co-authors for a brand new SANS course, which kind of forms the basis of this webcast, which is the 4.308 course, the Digital Forensics Essentials. To say that I sort of still get a thrill from catching bad guys is probably an understatement. I really love investigations. I really love the thrill of the hunt. I really love the chase. I really love to put my sort of intellect or my mind against that of the attackers and the other sort of offenders that we investigate. And it's a great satisfaction, feeling a real satisfaction when you've done an investigation, you can kind of put all the pieces together, or you've responded to an incident and you can determine exactly what took place, how the attackers got in, how the systems were compromised, and basically identify the weaknesses and shortcomings in the system. And I suppose probably more important than not, I am very proud to be a nerd, which is probably why I sort of naturally gravitated to this kind of work. So let's really sort of get into the meat and potatoes now. Firstly, the sort of point of this webcast is to really talk about building a foundation, getting started in forensics. Now, I suppose in the discussion about building or starting in forensics, we've got to kind of realize where forensics came from initially. And forensics initially came from law enforcement, towards the sort of late 80s, early 90s. Average detectives around the world, whether it be in the United States, the UK, South Africa, Australia, Germany, we were all investigating cases at some point where people kind of, or some kind of digital evidence was involved. There was a computer involved, there was a printer involved, there was always some kind of electronic device involved. And for many of us, we kind of fell into digital forensics. It wasn't like there was a formalized profession or a discipline or anything along those lines. Many of us were just sort of simple detectives that were pretty much the nerds of the nerds of the day. We loved computers, and we realized that we could figure out how to get evidence from them during our investigations. And that was really the sort of origin of digital forensics. It wasn't something that we sort of consciously thought about. It's just something that naturally and organically evolved over time. But obviously, we've moved a lot, sort of really long past the days of just law enforcement only digital forensics. If you look at most organizations around the world these days that have some kind of data that they need to safeguard or protect, or they have resources they need to protect, they've got to defend themselves against insider threats, they've got to defend themselves against external threats. And in many of those organizations, there's a big need for some kind of forensic capacity, whether it be actual investigation capacity, aimed at some kind of court scenario, or whether or not it's the simple incident response capability to be able to actually respond to an incident and address it accordingly. And I think it's very important to realize that whole change of dynamic in the digital forensics field has meant that digital forensics has evolved, and which it also means that we have multiple entry points to now get into the field. We have a lot of people still coming through the traditional law enforcement, military, intelligence services route. People who have a keen understanding of computers or a real interest in computers, as well as have a knack for investigations. They sort of find themselves in digital forensics. But we also see other entry routes, people going to college and university and studying courses and moving into digital forensics, or people who are in general IT or in computer security who start to move into incident response or forensics from that point of view. And even in some instances, people that have been working in the accounting or the legal fields moving into digital forensics. So gone are the days of having almost like a traditional career path that came from law enforcement, where you had people exposed, from an investigative background moving into this technical field. We now have people from all over and different walks of life entering into digital forensics. And this has created a few interesting challenges for us, because depending on where you come from, you may have gaps in your knowledge in terms of being a well-rounded digital forensics practitioner. And this is, largely borne out with a lot of research that's been conducted around the world as well, where we realize that, for example, people sometimes coming from a law enforcement background may lack certain of the technical competencies that we might find from somebody who comes from a computer science background, computer science degree in college. Or we might find somebody who has a really highly technical background who's come from system admin or network admin, understands systems inside and out, but doesn't always necessarily have the fundamental understanding of how to conduct investigations or understand some of the legal aspects. And during my time in SANS as an instructor, I'd often teach classes around the world where I'd have one or more students come up to me during a class that I was teaching and asking questions fundamentally about some of these other areas of forensics, whether it be testifying in court or how to prepare a report or some of the basic fundamental knowledge areas. And oftentimes this wasn't something that we purposely taught in class, but for those of you that have attended a SANS training course, a lot of the instructors have a lot of war stories. And especially in the forensics faculty, with most of us doing actual investigations on a day-to-day basis, we have a lot of stories that we like to share with our students. And unfortunately, or should I say fortunately in this case, it means the students realize that there's certain areas that they're not getting. So myself and two other aspirants and instructors, so Catherine Headley and Phil Moore, quick shout out to both of them, got together to basically develop a course for the SANS Institute, which would basically be a foundation level course for digital forensics. And we put quite a bit of effort into developing this course to basically serve as a set of foundation guidelines for anybody starting out in digital forensics, by providing them the core skills and knowledge that they need to be successful in their career. But we've also designed it in such a way that even if you're an experienced forensics practitioner, so for example, somebody that comes from a very deep technical background, There's aspects in the course such as investigative thinking, forensic concepts, some of the legal aspects that are critical to the job as well. So we feel that we've developed something that's going to be of benefit to the forensics community worldwide, and certainly help us with some of the things that we want to achieve. So where do we start with? If we look at some of the sort of key foundation steps that we need to look at in digital forensics, and this is some of the key things we help students to understand with the 4308 course. And that's really to understand firstly what digital forensics actually is. And the reason we feel this is important is that oftentimes we get a lot of conflicting definitions about what digital forensics is. People have some strange ideas sometimes. Usually as a result of people that have watched way too many episodes of CSI Cyber and believe that we can do absolute miracles with what we do. And I think it's important for people to have a realistic appreciation of what digital forensics can do and can't do. And then coupled with that, people that are doing digital forensics need to have a real good appreciation of what digital evidence is, what it is, where do we find it, how do we get it, legally, what value can that digital evidence have for us if we're doing an investigation or we are responding to a security incident. One of the key factors in forensics, and this sometimes a bit of contentious view, is that forensics in general is often deemed to be for court. So people think of, if you're doing digital forensics, you must have the intention of taking people to court and prosecuting them or litigating against them or so on. And I must say that's not always the case. If I'm responding to a particular incident and I realize that I'm investigating an APT group based out of a country that we have no jurisdictional powers over or no extradition treaty with, there's no ways I'm ever going to be able to bring anybody to book in a court of law. So in many investigations, many of the forensic investigations that are conducted, the best we can hope for is to actually identify the attacker's methodology, modus operandi, their tools, tactics, and processes, identifying indicators of compromise, and basically use that to harden our systems or develop additional threat intelligence. But that being said, if we are doing an investigation, we still need to be aware of the evidential issues. And while mileage may vary in this regard simply because of different jurisdictions, the reality is that it's not always the case that you may want to take somebody to court. There may be an instance where in your organization you've been breached, and I specifically think of Europe with GDPR at the moment. There's been a breach, somebody's personally identifiable information has been compromised, and that leads to an investigation by a regulator or a other competent authority. And the problem is as soon as that investigation is conducted, the organization now has to be on the defensive to defend their own processes. And sometimes the evidence that's used in that incident response can actually be the evidence that you use in your own defense. So we have to accept the fact that digital evidence can be useful in all manner of legal or investigative scenarios as a result. Obviously, the other things that we deal with in terms of foundational knowledge is actual core digital forensics principles and processes. Gone are the days where digital forensics was, us as a bunch of police detectives flying by the seat of our pants, kind of figuring things up as we went along. We've become a lot more structured now. Now, I'm definitely not one for playbooks. I know a lot of people out there like them. I personally don't like them at all because I think they take away your creativity. But we have come up with a number of defined principles and processes that do define what we do. So there is structure to what we do now in digital forensics. So it's important for somebody to understand those principles. Then for those either aspirant managers, team leaders, bosses that are involved in digital forensics or might potentially become involved in digital forensics, it's also important to understand some of the management issues and the development issues around digital forensics practitioners. How do we build the teams? How do we maintain them? How do we manage them, and so forth? And then looking at things like the key challenges in digital forensics and understanding some of the core legal issues. As I said earlier, pardon me, I promise it's not Corona. We don't, we have to also accept the fact that there's no, that there are legal issues that we have to deal with in dealing with digital forensics. So I just want to, this is the sort of big fundamental reason why we've developed the 308 course, is to really give opportunity for an aspirant digital forensics practitioner or an existing digital forensics practitioner to develop these foundational skill areas that are critical for the more complex digital forensics tasks that we teach on the other forensics classes on SANS. Such as 498, the battlefield forensics and acquisitions, or 610 reverse engineering, or any of the other classes that sort of come in between. So one of the things that we've developed the 308 course to basically cover a number of topics, and these are the ones that we have on the slide at the moment. And really what we've tried to do is we've tried to cover the whole ambit of digital forensics as a discipline. So the best way I can sort of think to describe it, if I look at somebody that goes and does the Windows Forensics course, the 4500, you are learning in that course fundamentally how to identify core Windows artifacts, to understand the meaning of those artifacts in an investigative scenario, and how to interpret the results of, or the data we get from those artifacts, and how to use those in an investigation. Where the 308 course would come into, in terms of, for example, say the 500 course, as while the 500 course would largely teach you some of the whats and the whys and the hows and things along those lines on specific technical issues. The 308 course would teach some of the core foundational aspects about why we should follow a particular approach, or why we should structure an investigation in a certain way, or what kind of processes we should follow in our investigation. So, for example, we will often talk about, in both 500 and 508 that I teach, we'll talk about this concept of pivot points. And one of the things that we go into quite some detail in the 308 course is what is a pivot point? What is the concept of a pivot point? How can we use that in investigation? How can we use it in things like temporal analysis as well as relational analysis? So we deal with all the theoretical foundations and practical frameworks that you actually need to do digital forensics, and then all of the techniques and methodologies that we teach in the other SANS courses fit on top of that to basically provide the complete digital forensics picture. So in terms of the modules that we cover, and I'm going to go through these quickly before I give you just an example of what some of the material that we cover on the courses. And when I talk about these modules, these are also what we deem to be the core digital forensics processes and principles. The first one is basically, firstly, understanding exactly what we mean by digital investigation. And again, the reason that we've decided to specifically focus on this is think about how many different organizations or entities do some kind of digital investigation these days. The most common one that we think about is, how do I put it, a police detective or the FBI or Secret Service or National Crime Agency or somebody like that is doing an investigation that requires digital evidence. There's some kind of cybercrime or some kind of fraud or murder. Those are easy to understand. But what about when the military makes use of digital investigations? When a special ops team goes, to sort of deal with the target, one of the key things that they'll deal with is look at what kind of data can they get from devices, from cell phones, from laptops, all these communication devices that their target might be utilizing. The same thing can be said in litigation. If you look at the advent of e-discovery, regulatory investigations, there's a whole host of different things that we can think about where digital investigation comes into play. And it's a lot broader than just the sort of the police investigation that most of us think about. We'll also quite extensively go into exactly what digital evidence is, starting literally at the bit level, working all the way up from there. I always like to say that it's all about the numbers, and ultimately that's what we really want our, the people that attend the course to appreciate, is that everything we do in digital forensics, everything that we deal with in digital evidence, all has to do with numbers. So it's understanding the core numbering systems of computers and how everything is put together from that fundamental basic all the way up to the most complex digital artifacts. And coupled with that, we'll look at the sources of digital evidence, exactly where we can find evidence. And in this regard, we literally cover everything from what we would typically expect from hard drives, removable media, and mobile devices, all the way to complex devices, Internet of Things devices, drones, and so forth. And then look at some of the challenges that we actually have in dealing with digital evidence, both practically and in terms of the legal system. Then we also, as we sort of looked at the previous section, we looked at digital investigation. Now we go into more in-depth about digital forensics as a discipline. And one of the focus areas here is to focus on digital forensics principles. Now, as digital forensics has evolved over the years, it has almost to an extent codified itself in actual standards and processes. So, if I look at some of the earliest processes, such as the International Organization for Computer Evidence, that gave rise to things like the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, gave rise to things like the ACPO standards in the United Kingdom, the NISA standards in Europe, and now we've seen the development of ISO standards specifically dealing with digital forensics. So it's very important, if you're going to do digital forensics, to understand these various standards and frameworks that basically govern what we do. Obviously, we're going to look at some of the challenges around digital forensics as well, and sort of importantly, how do we build and maintain a digital forensics team? I think that's something that we often don't think about. We don't think about the challenges of actually building a digital forensics capacity in any organization. So it does help for us to consider that as well. We can't talk about digital forensics without dealing with incident response. And one of the reasons that we've kind of dealt with digital forensics and incident response slightly separately is that when you do digital forensics in general, there is the anticipation of some kind of legal outcome. When you do incident response, there's not always the anticipation of a legal outcome. So there's certain things we might do slightly differently. One of the things also that we need to consider with incident response is it almost takes a forensic engineering approach where effectively a system has failed, something has happened which has allowed a system to be compromised, and we need to be in the position to do the root cause analysis to actually identify what has taken place effectively, so we can help guide for the building of a better system. And then coupled with the incident response stuff is this concept of forensic readiness. And for those of you that have ever done an incident or done an investigation, you suddenly find that crucial log files that you need have never been kept in the first place. We'll appreciate why this is actually an issue that needs to be addressed when we are considering incident response, and even just general digital forensics, is how do we harden organizations before something bad happens so we can maximize the use of digital evidence in those organizations. And then we sort of really start to get into some of the core issues of digital forensics itself, starting at how do we get the digital evidence? And again, there's a whole bunch of standards and principles that we will deal with here, specifically the new ISO 27037 standard, which deals with the acquisition of digital evidence. And we basically go into a fair amount of depth with these processes because once again, the SANS 498 course does an exceptionally good job of going into some of the technical details of how to do the acquisitions and how to triage the evidence. We sort of focus very much here on the principles and processes, how to do it right, how to even develop new methodologies when it comes to this kind of process, which is the acquisition of digital evidence. And what's very important for us when we talk about the acquisition is that this is the one time that you have to collect the evidence correctly. I know it's maybe a trite saying to say, but it's like you've broken an egg and now you try to put the egg back together again. I always think back to the childhood Humpty Dumpty analogy. But the reality is you only get to do the acquisition right once. I can make a mistake when I'm analyzing evidence, and another analyst can come and analyze it and correct my mistakes. But if I've made a mistake in the acquisition process, I don't get a second bite to the cherry in most instances, especially looking at things like live systems or running memory or encrypted hard drives and things along those lines. So we need to look at all of those kind of issues, looking at how we acquire the evidence, some of the unique challenges we face in acquiring the evidence. And then moving on from the acquisition, we need to look at how do we actually do forensic analysis? How do we prove our cases? As much as a lot of vendors out there have amazing tools, I'm yet to find a single forensic tool or even a group of forensic tools that literally I push a single button and the magical evidence fairy jumps out and gives me all the answers. At the end of the day, digital forensics and incident response is one of those areas where we're not going to necessarily be replaced by artificial intelligence or machine learning anytime soon, because in many instances it still requires the skills of a human analyst to be able to analyze that data. So we'll look at things like how to actually do analysis, various kind of analytical methodologies, critical thinking skills, all of those aspects that actually make for a successful analysis of digital evidence. We often joke and say that forensic analysis is part science and part art, and the reality is that's often the case. Where forensic analysis is very much scientific in terms of the methodologies that we approach, but it's also very much art in terms of how we can apply human intuition and creativity in solving these problems. And then obviously we'll look at the various standards that exist, such as the new ISO standards that deal with analysis and tool selection and techniques. And then lastly, in terms of the course, we need to look, whether we want to admit it or not, the things that most of us don't like to do when we're doing digital forensics. And that's things like our documentation. How do we document our investigation? How do we present our findings? How do we draw up reports? How do we present our findings? Again, these are some of the most critical aspects in digital forensics, because if we can't correctly articulate our results or communicate our results, we can definitely find ourselves not being very effective. And I'd also like to take the opportunity now to give a shout out to Lenny Zalz's cybersecurity writing course that SANS offers as well, which really does a fantastic job of actually getting clear writing principles and communication principles out there. And then coupled with this, we also have to deal with some of the legal aspects. So we need to make sure that people working in digital forensics have a fair understanding of legal principles, specifically around evidence. What makes evidence legal? It's almost like sort of common knowledge that when we go to court, one of the things that lawyers will often do is they'll either try and attack the person who's presenting the evidence, or they'll fundamentally attack the principles and processes around how the evidence was obtained. For the fundamental reason, if I can get the evidence thrown out of court, then any potential evidence linked from that evidence can potentially get thrown out of court as well. And if I don't have evidence in court, I can't get a successful finding. So it's just something to bear in mind. And then we'll also cover quite extensively something that a lot of people dread and find terrifying when they move into the world of forensics, is the day that you get called up to testify in court. It's not as bad as it sounds. A lot of people, almost go into a flat panic when they realize that they've got to go to court. And the reality is that it's actually not that difficult if you know what to do. And we'll cover all of those steps in the course itself. So I want to give you a short sneak peek of some of the material that will be in the course. And obviously this is very much a short peek, But I want to just talk about, for example, some of the digital forensics principles that we will talk about in general in the course. You know, what makes forensics different from any other kind of IT or investigative related activity. And one of the reasons being is that obviously if you're doing forensics, you need to basically tie various pieces together. The core area that we need to focus on is obviously evidence, and that evidence basically has to tie together the scene of the incident or where it happens. So for example, if we're dealing with a compromised network, it would be, you know, the various boxes on that network that are being compromised, or various devices or things along those lines. We need to tie that to a victim. Again, could be a physical victim, could be an organization, and then even to a suspect. And basically we have this triad of things that we need to be able to prove in an investigation. And these elements also then tie into certain legal elements as well that we need to look at during the course of the investigation. So the whole focus of the principles in digital forensics is really to try and resolve these issues using evidence and link everything together to get to an answer. Now digital forensics has evolved somewhat, and again, this is one of the reasons why we've seen the development of things like the new ISO standards, or the constant development and refinement of the SWGDE standards in the United States. And the reality is now is that digital forensics is regarded and accepted as a full-blown forensic science. So this is not just something that, you know, hey, you know, we're just going to go and you know, buy ourselves a license for the latest and greatest forensic tool, and we're just going to start fiddling around with things to try and figure out how things work. There's actually a scientific methodology behind it. And when you go and testify in court, and you are testifying about digital evidence, and you are saying that you are a digital forensics practitioner, there is a assumption from the court, or at least an expectation from the court, that you actually are a forensic scientist, that you are practicing a form of forensic science. As a result, that people need to understand that because we are considered a forensic science, we need to be able to play by the rules of the forensic science game, which means that our methodologies have to be scientifically sound. We basically are using existing computer science methodologies and techniques. We're using mathematics, a whole bunch of other different things, effectively to try and resolve a rather technical issue in a legal setting. So when we talk about forensic science in general, there are fundamentally a set of principles and processes that are generic and apply to forensic science as a whole. And obviously this also applies to digital forensics. Effectively, we refer to these as the Eman-Rudman paradigm. And that is named after the criminologists that basically developed and proposed these principles and processes. But the two principles that we talk about is effectively the divisibility of matter. Now, again, this comes from a world of physical forensics, but basically what this means is if I have a narcotic substance, for example, I don't have to test every single molecule of that narcotic substance to say what type of narcotic it is. I merely have to test a sample of it to say that. So basically it's that a part of the whole allows you to determine the characteristics of the whole. Now, to a large extent, we do that with digital forensics as well, due to the ability that we have to replicate data with 100% accuracy. So just like, for example, if you're doing DNA forensics and you're using PCR reactions to effectively increase the amount of DNA you have for analysis, we can do the same thing by being able to replicate the data over and over and over again for testing and analysis purposes. And then transfer, which is something that I'll deal with in a few moments. And then again, the processes that kind of tie into those principles, which I'll also discuss on an individual basis, is things like being able to identify things, being able to classify certain types of evidence, and then to be able to show associations between different types of evidence and reconstruct events that have happened in the past. So the first principle that I want to talk about is this whole issue of transfer. Now, effectively, this comes from the French criminalist Edmond LOCARD, who in the 1800s came up with what he referred to as the exchange principle. And basically it comes down to this, and this is kind of very apt if you think about it with the situation we face in the world at the moment. But whenever two objects come into contact with each other, there's a reciprocal transfer of information from one to the other. So, if I shake somebody's hand, the act of handshaking rubs off epithelial skin cells from my hand onto their hand. So there's a bit of me on them and a bit of them on me. There's fingerprints on each of our back of the hands as our fingers have clasped each other's hands. There'll be perspiration on each other's hands from the other person. So we kind of leave a bit of each other on each other. And I know that it's kind of gross and disgusting, especially in today's environment. But we see the exact same thing happening when we look at computer devices. When, for example, I connect onto a network and, I connect to the DHCP server, for example, the MAC address on my computer is talking to the the network interface card on my computer is talking to the DHCP server. I share the MAC address of my network interface card with the DHCP server. The DHCP server receives that MAC address, stores it, assigns an IP address to my computer, and that IP address is stored in the registry of my computer if I'm on a Windows machine. So there's always evidence of that kind of interaction between two things, and it's very difficult not to see that kind of evidence on a computing system. And then again, I spoke earlier about the divisibility of matter, where basically I can take a file and I can replicate it identically as many times as I need to do whatever kind of forensic analysis I need to do it. I never have to really worry about destroying the evidence because I can continuously replicate it so long as I have at least one full forensic image available for preservation. This is something that we cover quite extensively on the 500 course, for example. In fact, in most of the SANS courses that I've taken in the forensics faculty. But this whole concept of the LOCARD principle, and this is often seen to be the cornerstone of forensic science. And effectively, what we are showing when we do digital forensics is we've been able to show interaction between things. Interaction between a user and a process, interaction between a USB device and a computer, interaction between a file and a hard drive. All of these processes can be shown through forensic analysis. So this allows us to really get a good sense of what's taken place on a system. When it comes to the processes themselves that we talk about in digital forensics, one of the fundamental processes we need to do is identification, and that's really identifying what type of digital evidence we're dealing with, whether it be understanding what kind of file system is used, what kind of numbering system is used, whether we're looking at reading data in big endian or little endian, depending on the architecture of the chips that we're dealing with. The type of files, all of that falls under this realm of identification. And we need to be able to concretely identify files and be able to categorize them from that point. That leads us to our next process, which is our classification and individualization. And that's basically, classification is about taking data that we've identified or structures that we've identified and classing it into particular classes that make sense when we go to court or make sense from an ontological perspective. In terms of individualization, that's been able to say that this particular file is unique or can be linked to a certain thing. So for example, if we have a particular piece of malware that we have a known hash value for that malware, and we identify that file on the system, just simply by virtue of the hash value of that file, we can then say that this particular file is exactly the same as this type of malware, for example. So that allows for that kind of individualization. What's very important, again, when we talk about these principles in terms of classification, is actually understanding the sort of big meta classifications, if I can put it that way, on a system. You know, understanding, for example, that for any file on the system, that file, I always like to refer to this when I'm teaching 500. I, as a human being, am a human being. If you had to look at me as a person, you'd be able to make an observation that I was a certain height, I have a certain hair color, I have a certain eye color. You know, you could estimate my weight. You could identify, you know, potentially what ethnic group I am based on a whole bunch of physical features, but none of that tells you who I am. If you had to dissect me, if you had to pull my DNA apart, you would not see my name. The only way you'd be able to determine who I was or what I was would be through some kind of external documentation, such as my passport or birth certificate or something along those lines. So I often use that to explain the difference between file data and file system metadata. The file data is me, it's my DNA. Effectively, it's the contents of a file. And the file system metadata is things like the name of the file, where it's located, when it was created, and so forth. And those two components really make together what most people think of as a normal file on a system. But within the file data itself, we can also have file metadata, which is data about the file data, which may be of use for whatever application is creating that metadata. So things like the XF data on a photo that you've taken on your smartphone that may have the GPS coordinates of where that photo was taken. It forms part of the file itself, but it's not the actual contents of the file. So one of the things that I had developed, and this is part of the material that is in the 408 course, is an evidence classification model, and it's something that I've developed in my PhD research. And it's really about how do we classify digital evidence in such a way that we meet the sort of fundamental principles of forensic scientific evidence. So we have developed this ability, and we'll discuss it in far more detail on the course. But basically, we can take any single piece of evidence that we extract from a computer system or packets that we capture in transmission, and we can either show those as logical digital evidence artifacts or as trace digital evidence artifacts. And then we look at different areas as well, such as artifacts that talk about user activity, applications, and so on. And this model basically forms a fundamental classification framework for digital evidence to allow us to basically explain in court how everything fits together. The last two processes that I'm going to cover before I'll close up for some questions, because I can really talk about this for the next couple of hours, is the issue of association and reconstruction. And for me, these are the core aspects of what we do digital forensics for. Now, as I mentioned, I come from a law enforcement background, and even in the private sector, I've realized that there are different levels of how digital forensics is conducted. And for many people out there doing digital forensics, especially if you're not in the incident response world, but you're in the fraud world or something along those lines, digital forensics really consists of running whatever forensic image you have across one or two of your favorite tools of choice, looking for pictures, looking for emails, or running keyword searches to find files that match those keywords. And then once you found those files, you sit back with a broad smile on your face and say, wow, I've done good forensics, and that's it. But that's not what forensic science is about. Forensic science is not just about finding stuff, it's about interpreting and analyzing stuff. And this is where the association and reconstruction aspects come into play from a forensic process point of view. So one of the things that I need to do is I will have multiple pieces of evidence in any investigation that I'm conducting. And I need to be able to see how those pieces of evidence are associated to each other. What's the link between them? And that linkage is absolutely critical, especially when we start to talk about things like pivot points and following the sort of the evidential trail in a case. And probably more important than not is the ability to do reconstruction. one of the things that we have to do in forensics is we need to basically say what happened. Again, somebody hacks into our network and we're doing incident response. It's not just good enough for me to be able to go to my bosses and say, hey boss, you know what, somebody hacked our network and you know what, they used this malware. I'm going to need to be able to explain what happened, when it happened, how it happened. I need to explain the timeline. I need to explain those processes, because all the things that we could possibly investigate in the realm of digital forensics are all fundamentally based on human activities. Even that automated malware that's running off a system-generated process because I've set up a scheduled task to execute the malware, a person still had to do it. Somewhere at the end of the day, there's always a person behind it, and all human activity takes place on a chronological timescale. Things have a start and an end, or a process that we go through. So forensics really, if that's the gold standard of forensics, is about reconstruction. For us to be able to say, this is what happened, this is the evidence that's involved, and if our evidence is strong enough, to be able to say, this is the person who potentially did it. So that's pretty much just on, say, 45 minutes, almost 50 minutes, to talk about what we've been talking about in the 308 course. It is a new course, as I mentioned. It'll be going live later this year, and we really believe that this course will actually give us the ability to bring new people into the digital forensics field through a more structured, organized process, but also give opportunity to existing digital forensics practitioners who feel that they need skills in testifying, or they need to understand some of the core principles and processes, or need to understand how to build an investigation, to come and do a course like this, to actually equip themselves with all of those additional skills. At the end of the day, we really, from a course author point of view and from a practitioner point of view, we just would like to see the best possible digital forensics practitioners out there. People who have all the skills, all the knowledge, and all the capability to effectively catch the bad guys, to effectively identify the threats to their system, and to effectively be able to make a difference in their organization. So with that, Carol, over to you. If there are any questions, I've got about 10 minutes or so, I think, to answer them. So I will hand over to you.
All right, thanks, Jason, for that great presentation. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but we'll give you a moment to think about it. I would like to remind everyone that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And also, you can find your CEUs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigate to your account dashboard, then click My Webcasts. You can then download your CEU on the right-hand side of the web page. All right, Jason, I'm not seeing anything.
Cool.
Did you want to hang out for a minute or move on?
Yeah, so I, if anybody's got any questions that they don't want to ask here, my contact details are on the slides. Please feel free to drop me a mail, hook me up on Twitter. We're happy to discuss the course with you, both myself and my two co-authors. And yeah, and if you just genuinely want any career advice or things along those lines from a digital forensics practitioner perspective, please feel free to be in contact. I love to be able to mentor people moving into this industry. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I'm happy to assist you guys at any time. Well, I would say day or night. I've kind of lost track of exactly what time I'm in these days. So yeah. So if you have anything, please feel free to reach out to us. You know, we're very keen to help you from a SANS perspective. So yeah. And if there's no questions, the best I can ask is, you know, everybody please stay safe. You know, I won't say keep distance and all that kind of stuff, but it is dangerous out there. So look after yourself, look after your loved ones, and just stay safe.
All right, thanks, Jason. We did have one question submitted.
Okay, cool.
If I'm working on bank and one of the team just bring one laptop and machine to me and ask me to perform forensics on these machines, how can I handle if my boss is pushing me too much?
Okay, that's actually a very good question. So you sometimes
Oh,
there's
and
the
Jason, I'm so,
oh,
they followed up with,
oh okay.
he is non-technical. The boss
Okay,
is non-technical.
okay. That sounds about right. I've just actually done an investigation recently for a big multinational client, where we had to do digital forensics work. There was some fairly complex technical issues that we had to deal with, and unfortunately, the engagement manager that engaged our services was not technical at all, didn't understand digital forensics, had come from a pure audit background, and had no idea what to do. And we were literally faced with the, hey, we gave you this computer 5 minutes ago. Why don't we have a result yet? So the simple fact is, and I know we kind of covered this on 500 and on the 498 course. We have to get to the evidence faster. So one of the things that we're trying to deal with now, especially in terms of the new standards, is to be able to get to the evidence faster and get the results quicker. But even when we're doing that, I often find that those non-technical managers still don't understand the process. And again, I don't blame them. Oftentimes, literally, they've watched one too many episodes of CSI Cyber or NCIS. Somebody just plugs in a hard drive, and it images in like 30 seconds. I still remember with absolute terror an episode of CSI Miami where Eric Delco goes in while Horatio Kane is distracting the drug dealer, and he plugs in a USB thumb drive, and like literally 30 seconds later walks off and says, oh, well, your boss, I've got the forensic image, that 1 terabyte laptop hard drive. That doesn't make our lives any easier. But I think the best thing that we can do is we sometimes need to educate upwards. Now, it's something I've often had to do in courts when I testify. I have to effectively educate the judge or educate the jury, and I have to almost take the role of a teacher and walk them through the processes so they have a realistic understanding. So what I'll often do in a situation like that is I'll try and engage with the manager, and if the manager is willing to it, I'll get the manager to actually spend some time with me, and I'll try and let my passion for the field rub off on them and say, hey, I really want to show you this thing, and I get them to understand the complexities of what it is that we do, so they have a more realistic appreciation of what digital forensics actually takes. And I know, like I said, you work in the banking environment. You get a laptop, some kind of internal fraud case, and everybody wants the things to happen immediately. But the problem is, if you don't do those processes right, if you rush them, at the end of the day, somebody walks or they sue you for wrongful prosecution or wrongful litigation or something along those lines, and that's problematic. So as far as possible, I try to educate upwards. I'll try and engage with those managers as best as I can, show them my passion, show them like really cool, interesting stuff, but also help them to understand that things take time. And sometimes it's a simple matter of, hey, boss, have you ever tried to just copy your whole hard drive? How long did that take? Just copying a normal hard drive can take 3-4 hours these days. So those are just some of the things that you can potentially do in terms of educating and managing upwards.
All right, so the next question says, would you recommend collecting all artifacts for all cases or collect only what I'm interested in for each case?
Okay, so this is an interesting one, and I'll use this analogy. So again, digital forensics has come a long way over the years. When we started digital forensics, the sort of mantra that we lived with was capture everything. We'd go image the whole hard drive with everything on it, and that was great when it was a 20 gig hard drive. Now that we're looking at like 2 to 4 terabyte hard drives, you've really got to ask yourself, firstly, do you need everything on that hard drive? And secondly, even if you did get everything on the hard drive, how long would it take you to actually analyze all that data on the hard drive? So there's been a move, and I'm actually doing some research on this at the moment, But this issue, and again, we've sort of colloquially referred to it as triage forensics, where we only collect the evidence that we need. But I want you to think about the world of real-world forensics. So let's just say I'm sitting in the Hilton in Washington, D.C., or the Radisson Blu in London, and and sometime during the night I get killed in my hotel room. I don't know. One of my students decides I've been a horrible instructor and decides to do me in. And the next morning, the cleaning staff get to my hotel room, they open the door, and they find my dead body lying on the bed. And obviously, there's screaming involved, and people go running for the hills. But at some point, law enforcement is going to come, they're going to get involved. And they're going to come to the hotel, and they're going to do what law enforcement does when they're doing an investigation. They're going to potentially seal off my hotel room, and they're going to look for evidence in the hotel room, and they will start asking questions. But the one thing that they're not going to do is they're not going to seal off the entire hotel room, the entire hotel. So the hotel might have 500 rooms in it. They're only going to preserve the evidence in one room unless they need to go and look in another room. So say, for example, they have witnesses or they have CCTV camera that puts me in the dining room and I don't know, like a conference room or something like that. They might go look there for evidence. In the physical world of forensics, we don't go and preserve everything because we physically can't. We know where we can look to find evidence, and we preserve that evidence. And never once have we ever had an issue in court where we've gone to court and the court has said to us, Mr. JORDAAN, is it possible that you missed evidence? Well, it's always possible that I missed some evidence, but I've been specifically trained to look for evidence. And in this particular environment, these were the tests that I looked for to find the evidence. Now, the same thing can be said in digital forensics these days. When we were starting out in digital forensics, we really didn't know what we were looking for. So we erred on the side of caution and we just collected everything. But we cannot say now, 20 odd years since the birth of digital forensics, we can't look back anymore and say, you know what, we don't know what we're collecting anymore, because we actually do. And the reality is these days, I would actually say it's better to just collect the evidence that you need rather than try and collect everything. There's issues around privacy. We've seen in the United States in some of the circuit courts, there's been actions to try and minimize the amount of evidence that's being collected to not impede on people's privacy. And I think ultimately that's where forensics is going to go. I think in a couple of years' time, the days of just collecting everything, I think are going to be over. Unless there's an absolute particular reason why you need to collect everything, I don't think you need to anymore.
All right, they did say clarification, triage collection, not full hard drive image.
Yeah, okay. So yes, so like oftentimes when we're doing an investigation now, we will just do triage images because we know where the evidence is most likely going to be. So for example, if we're doing an intrusion investigation, the last thing I'm going to want to do is go and image 500 computers. Then we'll use triage examination. We'll use things like CAPE, for example, to go and collect just the evidence that we need to prove certain things. So yes, from a clarification point of view, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And in all the cases that we've used triage evidence, we've never actually had any queries in court or any comebacks where our evidence has been thrown out. So I honestly believe that the triage evidence and limited collections are the way to go.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jason, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content